Welcome to the 27th meeting of the Rural Affairs, Climate Change and Environment Committee. Members and the public should turn off mobile phones and Blackberries, as leaving them in flight mode or on silent will affect the broadcasting system. Agenda item 1 is a decision on taking business in private. I seek the agreement of the committee to take agenda item 5 and all future considerations of the evidence heard and draft reports on the Aquaculture and Fisheries Scotland Bill in private. Are we agreed?
Yes.
Thank you. Agenda item 2 is subordinate legislation. This item today is for the committee to consider 2 negative instruments as listed on the agenda on the Crofting register. Members should note that no motion to annul has been received in relation to these instruments, and I refer members to the paper. Does the committee have any views about the detailed paper that we've received? Yes, Dick Weil?
Convener, yet again I have some concerns over this legislation. I believe it needs to be tidied up in some ways, and I would welcome your direction in regards to it.
Thank you. Does anyone else have a comment? Having read the notes from Subledge about a degree of confusion and also a letter from the Minister, whilst the process of Subledge is that you would need to have launched a motion to annul, I think the answer is that we want these things to happen, but that we want them to happen in an uncluttered and clear fashion. So could I suggest that if, with your agreement, that we agree to these 2 pieces of Subledge, but that we write to the Minister and ask for an early laying of amending regulations, if at all possible. Are we agreed? Thank you very much. We move on to agenda item 3 on ash dieback. And at this stage, I'd like to welcome, as an interested member, Claire Baker. Good morning. And welcome the Minister, Paul Wheelhouse, and his officials, David Howat and Dr. James Pendlebury. Welcome to the meeting. I invite the Minister, if he wishes to make any short introductory remarks. We've had an excellent paper from you, and we look forward to asking questions. But good morning.
Good morning. And thank you, Convener. If I may just say in the outset that the matter which you just dealt with and the reference to Subledge Committee is something that is being pursued at the moment, so hopefully you'll have progress in that very shortly. Thank you for inviting me to discuss dieback of ash caused by Cholera fungus. As I said to the stakeholders that I met here in Parliament just 2 weeks ago, regretfully, ash dieback is clearly present in the UK and is likely to spread further. Following the surveys that have been carried out, we have 241 confirmed cases in the UK, of which 17 are in nurseries, 97 in recent planting sites, and 127 in mature trees in the wider environment. In Scotland, we have 23 confirmed cases now, including 1 nursery as well as 18 recent planting sites and 4 sites in the wider environment. And these numbers are all as at 27th of November, 6 p.m. Yesterday, and expected to be updated at midday today as the work in terms of the continuing laboratory tests are completed. Last Friday, I made a private visit to one of these sites in the wider environment near Eyemouth, where I learned of the difficulty in identifying mature disease trees where symptoms are more subtle to see. We have been working very closely with the UK Government and the other devolved administrations on this problem. Earlier in the month, we undertook a rapid snapshot survey to get a better feel for the current broad extent of the disease in Scotland. And I would like to pay tribute to all those who took part in this survey at very short notice. This survey was initiated on Thursday, the 1st of November, and completed just 5 days later ahead of schedule. Indeed, Forestry Commission Scotland staff went on to help counterparts in Northumberland. I've taken part in the emergency COBRA meetings chaired by Owen Patterson, the Secretary of State at DEFRA, and my officials are working closely with colleagues in other parts of the UK to develop a cholera control plan, which I expect to be published within the next week or so. Meantime, we have a ban on the import and movement of ash plants within the UK, a ban that the Scottish Government supports. An independent expert task force on tree health and plant biosecurity, led by DEFRA's Chief Scientific Advisor, Professor Ian Boyd, has been appointed to advise on tree and plant disease threats and make recommendations about how those threats could be addressed. It includes 3 experts from Scottish universities, Professor Nick Hanley from Stirling, Professor Tom Meagher from St Andrews, and Dr Steve Woodward from Aberdeen. And we're also expecting this task force to publish its interim report next week. It will produce a final report in spring 2013. Meanwhile, we have also commissioned an independent consultant, Dr Rick Worrell, to produce an initial assessment of the potential ecological and economic impacts of Clara in Scotland. This report will also be published in early December. The Scottish Summit, which I held 2 weeks ago, which was attended by more than 40 stakeholders, identified a number of key actions which we are taking forward. The Forestry Commission is developing advice on the management of ash, including the sensitive management of mature trees, techniques that could help slow down the spread of the disease and lessen its impact, identification of resistant strains of ash, and examining if there would be suitably isolated locations around Scotland that could perhaps act as a refuge for ash in Scotland. We also want to develop practical and affordable approaches to dealing with newly planted sites. Although our native ash is not a major component of woods and forests in Scotland, it is an important feature of our landscape, has considerable biodiversity value, and is also one of the most productive broadleaf species in terms of timber and firewood. I can assure the committee that we will take all reasonable steps to limit the impact of this disease, although, as you know, Convener, ash dieback is unfortunately just one of a number of tree health problems that we are facing at the moment. We have, for example, Dothystroma or red band needle blight affecting pine trees, especially in the north and east of the country, which poses a threat to the iconic Scots pine, and a range of threats from Phytophthora, including the current impact of Phytophthora rumorum on larch, particularly in Galloway and Argyllshire. I am pleased that the committee has chosen to consider this important and worrying issue. I look forward to answering any questions you may have at this stage. And as you said, Convener, I'm accompanied today by David Howat, who's Deputy Director of Forestry Commission Scotland, and Dr James Pendlebury, the Chief Executive of Forest Research. Thank you for the opportunity to make my opening remarks.
Thank you. We do want to take an interest in looking at this in some detail because, as you've expressed and as has been mentioned in the Chamber, at question time with First Minister, there are several species. Some people suggest as many as 15 species that have various threats to them at the moment. So how we handle ash will be a model perhaps, or maybe we shall see for certain of these others. Let's kick off the questions then. Graham Day.
Thank you, Convener. My question is perhaps best directed to David Howat. I wonder how in practice the Forestry Commission Scotland undertook the rapid survey of ash, and what did you learn from that process in terms of your ability to respond to developments such as these in the forestry sector?
Thank you, Convener. Well, as the Minister said, we initiated the survey on the 1st of November, and we were fortunate in Scotland because we've been carrying out this native woodland survey of Scotland, so we have pretty good information to begin with about where ash woods are in Scotland. So we were able to do that, to develop a sampling frame. But essentially what happened to Scotland was divided up into 10 kilometre squares, and within each one of those 10 kilometre squares we visited up to 4 ash woods where there were ash woods present. And so we had people throughout Scotland, with the exception of the Northern and Western Isles, going out over that period from the 1st of November to the 6th of November. These were foresters who were going out. They had protocols to see whether there was any evidence of ash dieback in the ash woods. Where they suspected something, then they would take photographs, report it. Then more experienced surveyors would then go to those particular sites, and if they confirmed the suspicion, then the samples were sent off to the laboratory for analysis. And what this essentially did, and this was carried out throughout the whole of Britain, it meant that we were able to develop a map showing the geographical distribution of ash dieback across Britain. And this is now being used, for example, by scientists in Cambridge University to model the epidemiology, to try to pick out a picture of a snapshot of where we have the disease at the moment, and using information from the continent and also using modelling of air movements and so on to pick up their best possible information as to what might be future developments of the disease.
In terms of moving forward, I mean, how do you sort of rate your own performance in that regard? Do you think that this process has identified things you could do better in future if something like this arose, or are you quite satisfied that you've performed well in this regard?
Things we can do better, convener. I think probably what we've got to think hard about is just, as you say, how we can learn lessons. And for example, as it happened, I'd organised the meeting before the ash dieback problem arose. But we had a meeting in the Forestry Commission just on Monday, bringing together the policy people in the Forestry Commission and other parts of the Scottish Government who do with other plant health threats, such as potatoes. And we had together the policy people. We also had the scientists from SASA, the Chief Scientific Advisor, Forestry Research, James Hutton Institute. And so the intention there was just, if you like, to sort of pool our expertise and to take stock of what expertise we have in Scotland, so we can start thinking about how we can move forward. And clearly what we're looking at the moment is, as the Minister mentioned, is the publication of the control plan for cholera next week, and also the interim report from the UK Chief Scientific Advisors Task Force. So I think those are the milestones next week, and building on that, we need to look at how we make best use of the capacity that we have in Scotland.
You talked about how you did the rapid survey of ash. How did we help our colleagues in England?
Well, essentially, we were fortunate perhaps that we managed to finish a bit early, and so therefore we were able to just to lend staff to help in the north of England.
Thanks for that. Jim Hume?
Yes, thanks, and good morning, everybody. The Minister's already mentioned that ash is not just an indigenous species, but it's also quite a valuable species, timber-wise, and I'm aware of the Eyemouth one in the Borders too. In the paper here, it states that there has been a prohibition on all imports of ash and movements of ash saplings, etc., but not of actual timber itself. It says it's low risk. Now, I mean, obviously, we've done a good survey, but obviously that was when we've had the fall of the leaves. The ash, as we all know, the leaves fall very early, so I'm concerned that obviously ash may show up to be more of a problem come June or July next year, where the ash leaf comes out again a late producer of a leaf. Therefore, I'm slightly concerned that timber of value, of course, is being allowed to still move around Great Britain. I would like to know how safe that is to do so.
Convener, if I may ask Dr. James Pendlebury to address that point.
Thank you, Convener. Hope I've got the microphone right. The issue around timber imports and movement, if the bark is removed from the timber, which it would be within the timber trade, so you're just shipping timber around, planks and things like that, then the risk of infection and transmission of infection, from what we understand from the literature, is minimal. It's about movement of bark and leaves, as you rightly say, that there will be issues. And in terms of the trade, they don't move logs around with bark on them anymore. It's mainly processed timber. There are concerns around maybe moving, let's say, firewood from infected sites. And the latest information and advice is if it's burnt locally within a few kilometres of a site, there's not a huge amount of risk of transmission of the disease. But the principal advice for large-scale timber movement, it'll be processed timber, it'll be dry, there won't be any bark on it, so as a consequence there shouldn't be a major risk.
Is there an estimation of the value of the ash timber in Scotland?
Not that I'm aware of.
No. Okay, fine, thanks.
Well, if I can,
sorry.
On that point, that I suspect it's comparatively low. I mean, as you say, ash is a valuable timber species, but it hasn't been grown on any scale as a productive species in Scotland. So there will be some ash of value, but it's not anything like to compare, for example, with our main productive species such as Sitka spruce and so forth. What we have done, as the Minister mentioned, is asked Dr. Rick Worrell to carry out a piece of work just looking at both the economic and the ecological impact of ash dieback in Scotland. I'm expecting his report next week, so that'll be able to add some facts and figures to that.
It'd be useful for at least some of us to see if that would be.
Yep. Yeah, and we'll try and follow it on. Angus MacDonald and then Margaret McDougall.
Yes, thank you, Convener. I'm just picking up on Jim Hume's theme. You may be aware, Minister, of my opposition to a proposed 100 megawatt biomass electricity plant in my constituency. I was therefore concerned to read in the stakeholders' meeting report that a potential pathway for other pathogens such as needle blight and pine, as you mentioned earlier, is through the importation of biomass for energy production. So I was hoping that you would undertake, Minister, to make the Energy Minister aware of this potential threat.
I certainly will undertake to share the information that we have, the scientific advice as we get it on the potential risks posed by imports of wood. Certainly Dr. Pendlebury has sort of made the point about sawn timber in terms of movement within the UK, but certainly I take the point in terms of bringing in imported wood that there's potentially a risk associated with importing any plant material to the UK. So I'll make an assurance to the committee member that I'll pass on any scientific advice we have to Fergus Ewing as Energy Minister.
Thank you.
Margaret McDougall.
And good morning, gentlemen. The cholera was first identified in England in February, confirmed in March, and then the first signs of the disease were picked up in Scotland in July. Could you tell me what action the Scottish Government was taking in that interim period just to try and... I know it's airborne, so it's very difficult to stop the disease from spreading, but was there any action taken by the Scottish Government in that interim period? And what would you do, if anything, differently if the same was to occur again with another disease that was identified, say in England? And what action can you take, and what strategies can you have in place to be prepared for the likes of this happening in the future?
It's certainly a reasonable question, Convener, and I welcome the opportunity just to clarify what was taking place in Scotland. Certainly you're correct, Margaret McDougall is correct in terms of the timeline, in terms of the first suspected sites in England having been identified in February and confirmed in March. And during the periods in question, the Scottish Government was advising the industry, the commercial industry, and also other stakeholders of the risks to Scotland of this work. We do regular nursery inspections in Scotland through Forestry Commission Scotland, and looking at the risks to the commercial nursery sector of all sorts of plant diseases, including cholera, clearly. And in May 2012, specific nursery inspections on cholera were undertaken in Scotland in response to what we knew was happening in England. In the 9th of July, unfortunately, signs of cholera were suspected on a newly planted site at Knock Mountain near Kilmacombe, which I'm sure the member is aware of. Unfortunately, on the 2nd of August, it was confirmed that it was on the following test results. It was confirmed that it was present on the site at Knock Mountain, Kilmacombe, and press releases were issued to raise awareness that cholera was present in Scotland and at Knock Mountain. Following that, there was routine nursery inspection, picked up signs of cholera in a nursery in the northeast of Scotland. So that was the first and only so far recorded incidents of cholera in a nursery, and in both cases the action was taken to destroy the trees. At that point there was still a presumption that it was still possible to prevent cholera ash dieback presenting itself as a major threat to UK trees. Unfortunately, now we realise it's much more present in the wider environment than had been expected. In terms of what work we could have done differently, I'm reassured in terms of the information I've been provided with between the first identification of the disease in 2010. So I'll just find the appropriate point just so I can make you aware of it. When we first discovered that the causal agent was this pseudo-albidus version of the sort of sexual phase of the fungus, as opposed to the albidus phase, which is an endemic fungus in the UK and has been presumed to be the cause of symptoms up to that point. From May 2010 onwards, the Forestry commissioned a Danish expert, Dr. Ivan Thompson, to undertake a quick survey of the condition of ash in Scotland. At that point, the 14 sites were visited, 33 samples taken, and the feedback was that only the endemic albidus fungus was found. So in Scotland, we did a check to see whether it was present in Scotland at that time and found no positive results in the sampling that was done. In addition, the National Forest Inventory was underway through 2009 to 2012, the point that David Howat referred to in terms of us having a knowledge of where ash trees are, including a basic assessment of tree health, and the methodology was supplied to surveyors specifically to provide an early warning of cholera in order to gather the evidence necessary for pest-free status if we were to have something like an import ban imposed at some point in the future. This included many individual tree inspections. While some ash crown dieback was observed, none was identified as this cholera ash dieback fungus. During all this time, the Forest Commission and Forest Research had cholera listed as one to watch, and Forest Research had information describing cholera symptoms posted on its website since 2009. I think the regret that we have is perhaps that a similar survey wasn't being done at the same time in the rest of the UK to identify whether, as we subsequently found, it's much more widely present in the wider environment in England than even to be fair to DEFRA, that DEFRA had any idea that it was that present because of this confusion about the non-dangerous fungus albidus versus the pseudo-albidus. So with the benefit of hindsight, had similar survey work been done at the same time in the rest of the UK, we might have had a better picture of whether it was already here and been able to act faster. But at that point, we had a genuine view that it wasn't present in Scotland, certainly, and had no information to suggest it reached the rest of the UK.
Thank you.
Okay. I'm going to come round the members, and I'm going to bring in Claire Baker after the members have had their questions. You will get room to roam then. It's the normal practice, because there's an awful lot of them. I think Alex Ferguson is first. Yeah.
Thank you, Convener. I think it was you that mentioned that ash dieback, this is but one of many diseases that has hit our forest estate in recent years. And the word importation has been mentioned quite often already, and I just want to ask a little bit about that, because it seems to me that the root cause of a lot of these diseases that have been hitting us are due to importation, largely. Therefore, it would make sense to grow as much of our nursery stock as we possibly can here in Scotland. And that's a point that's made in a report that I think we've all been sent by Confor, which I'm sure you're all aware have put forward an action plan, which I thought contained a number of very interesting issues on a UK-wide basis. But the one I wanted to ask about is whether, if we are to stop a demand for imported trees, then we have to have a steady planting plan in future years so that nurserymen know what to grow and there is a degree of continuity about the whole process. And obviously it's a long-term process. Can I ask whether that's something, Minister, perhaps you feel could be achieved, and if so, what steps the government can take to try to bring that about? Because it seems to me if we could grow all of the stock that we need, problem maybe not solved, but certainly partly solved.
I certainly recognise that the point Alex Ferguson has made. The issue I've met recently with Confor, and David Howat was present at that meeting as well, to discuss some of the challenges in relation to the transition in European funding through SRDP and replacement scheme for SRDP. We're all aware, I'm sure the committee more than done most in the chamber, that there are ongoing negotiations about CAP reform and the risks of delays in terms of agreeing budgets and the detail of successor schemes. Confor did make the point that and a reasonable point, I think, that the industry needs to have a degree of certainty about planting rates and the wider policy going forward, both in terms of the funding schemes, but also the policy in terms of what the balance will be between productive species and broadleaf, and within that, obviously, the species that we will recommend are used for various schemes. So I certainly take the general principle of what you're saying is absolutely true. Where we can give certainty, we clearly would seek to do so. We do have, obviously, the ongoing negotiations on CAP. We're aware that there is a risk for, in an interim period, that there would be a drop in co-financing available to the Scottish Government. And we're taking steps to ensure that we have contingency plans in place to minimise the disruption to our planting targets, which are critical as Environment and Climate Change Minister, to our ability to meet our 10,000 hectare per annum target for planting. In terms of the imports issue, you're quite right to suggest that that this is a pretty significant issue to deal with. It's a major step if we were to have sort of wider import bans for tree saplings, and it clearly would have consequences for the commercial nursery sector, but also for other businesses. And so we're keen that we examine those issues, and hopefully that will be addressed by the control plan and the work that's being done by Ian Boyd and others at UK level. The nursery industries do, they've made claims about the grant system, and the species of trees planted is ultimately the land manager's choice. So, ash is one of many species that's available. We are giving advice out about what they can use instead, and for existing projects and ones which are due to go into the pipeline. And we've averaged the UK sort of, I think the figures I saw earlier on actually, in terms of the share of broadleaf planting, for example, we have more than half of the total UK broadleaf planting last year was in Scotland. So it's clearly a disproportionately significant issue for us to address.
Could I just very briefly follow that up, Convener? Thank you. Thank you for that substantive response, Minister. I do appreciate that. But aside from the CAP difficulties and all that, which, as you rightly say, we've all been involved in, it is presumably, it would be good practice for our nursery stock to be grown here in Scotland, full stop. Is there anything the government can do to encourage that to happen? Obviously, part of that is certainty of the planting grounds, but presumably there are other incentives to be made to our nurserymen to produce the stock that we need in the future.
Well, certainly I fully accept the point. I think it's potentially, if there is an opportunity here for Scotland, for our nursery sector to grow its business in line with what we're clearly committed to our 10,000 hectare per annum targets as a government in terms of achieving those. So there's certainty there for the sector in terms of knowing the volume of work that there will be out there. If there are tighter controls and movement of plants into the UK, clearly that creates a really good market opportunity. The regulatory changes will create the market demand, if you like, and give them the certainty that there will be a need to supply projects across Scotland, about 10% of which are on Forestry Commission land, but 90% of which are on other landowners' properties. Certainly, if the committee has any suggestions as to means by which we can support that process to get us to the stage where we can have more indigenous availability of supply, then I'd be all ears. But maybe if I could ask David Howat to see if there's anything he specifically believes could be used as an incentive for that process.
No, I think Mr. Ferguson makes a very important point about, and the Minister, about this being an opportunity here for the nurseries, and I think it's, following on from this, it's one job we need to do is to work with the nursery sector, just seeing how we can take advantage of this opportunity to produce more stock domestically rather than having to rely on imports.
Thank you,
Nigel Don, and then Jim Hume.
And good morning, gentlemen. I'm wondering if I can just continue that discussion, but maybe look at it from the other side, because everything I think I've heard you just saying is about what the government is trying to do to help the private sector, which I entirely respect. Can I just ask, what are the private sector themselves doing in response to this change in their environment, please?
Well, if I can maybe just make an opening comment and then ask David Howat to respond. I think you raise a very important point, and we have been giving ongoing advice to nurseries throughout when cholera was first identified as a risk. nurseries were advised of the risk. Clearly, there has been ongoing guidance through the websites, through press releases, to the wider stakeholders who are purchasing products from nurseries, that this was a risk. So there is an onus on the end buyer of plants to ensure the provenance of what they bring into Scotland. So I think it's an important point. But if I can maybe ask David Howat just to outline what steps have been taken to work with the purchasers of tree products to ensure that they complied.
Yeah, in terms of working with the private sector, there's a number of different strands. In relation to the nursery sector, we were working very closely with them over the last 2 years in a number of nurseries that have suffered from the Dothystroma needle blight to help them produce clean stock. So that's been one strand of activity there. Another strand of activity has been, if you like, raising awareness amongst private sector forest managers, because what you're wanting, amongst other things, is eyes, particularly eyes, not so much ears, on the ground so that people can see what's happening. So what we've been doing is, as well as running seminars for our own staff, we've been running forest health days with forest research colleagues and getting private sector forest managers and others interested along to those. And they've been taking places in different parts of Scotland. And then at the more strategic level, Hamish MacLeod, who's the chair of our Forestry Commission National Committee for Scotland, also director of BSW Timber, he's convened a Scottish timber market impacts group, which is partly looking at future timber supply in the round, but it has a specific element of its remit to look at the impact of tree health problems on the timber industry. And part of this is to help encourage the private sector to respond. I mean, we're not just here talking about ash, but we're talking about, for example, the problem of Dothystroma and its impact on lodgepole pine and so on. So there's all part of, if you like, working with the private sector to help them understand what the potential consequences of these tree health problems are and how best to respond.
Thank you, Convener. It's just following up on Alex Ferguson's point about, there's been a plethora of diseases. We've seen sudden oak death, and we've now got ash at threat. And it's, again, on the point of supply, I used to be a trustee with Borders Forest Trust, and tree plantings wouldn't happen unless you were actually able to get indigenous species, and that was very local seed production. So, and David Howat mentioned, obviously, that it would be good to help the local supply. As a starting point, do we know what percentage of trees grown in Scotland are from stock sourced in Scotland? Because obviously that'd be a good starting point.
Convener, it came slightly as a surprise to me some weeks ago or months ago to realise the extent to which what is locally collected seed is then sent, for example, to the Netherlands to then be grown on and then comes back. So technically it's local provenance, but actually it's been grown elsewhere and brought back again. And what we've asked Rick Worrell to do as part of his impact assessment, and I know at the moment he's doing a lot of phoning around nurseries and so on, to get the best possible handle he can on your very specific question there about just exactly what is going on in the nursery trade.
Just before I come to Claudia Beamish next, when we started to plant our garden 20 years ago, we made sure that the stock was from local sources. There's very obvious stories about that we could go into in great detail. But the point about that is we had local people who'd collected the seed or the saplings. However, is there a labelling process which identifies in nurseries where the seed has been brought on? If it's local but has been sent to the Netherlands, is there labelling that could be implemented very quickly? Yep.
But for me, Convener, certainly just say that I think that's a very sensible suggestion that we should look at, and I will take that forward in any discussions I have with DEFRA on these matters. My understanding is that, and it came as a surprise to me just as much, even more so perhaps than it did to David Howat as a relative lay member here in terms of understanding this relationship, but it's essentially, it seems to be that seeds are exported to the Low Countries and other places because they can grow faster there. So it's merely just to speed up the process. And that's maybe from a very simplistic standpoint in my case, but that seems to be the process, and that came as a surprise to me. I entirely agree with the convener that that something like labelling should be in all areas of whether it's food production or plant material. I think it would be helpful to the consumer to make an informed choice. They were able to see where the product had come from. So I will certainly take forward that point. But if I can ask David Howat just to address the other aspect of what you were saying.
No, I think you're absolutely right, convener. I mean, the analogy that rings a bell with me is with Scotch beef, where it has to be born, reared and slaughtered in Scotland. And to date, the labelling is very much related to where the seeds have come from, and ignores, if you like, the rearing of those seeds. So I think it's a very good point.
Claudia Beamish, and then Dick Lyle.
Thank you, convener. Good morning, Minister, and to you both as well. You asked about any projects that might be helpful to highlight in this instance in relation to local seed collection, and I would just highlight the project that Scottish Wildlife Trust has drawn to my attention, which is actually in the Highlands, and I hope I'm pronouncing it right, but do correct me, anyone who knows better. It's Koya Acinth project, and that does involve... I think I've got it wrong, convener, but never mind. Oh, thank you. And it does involve local landowners working together to collect seed, and the provenance of that is I think, assessed, and this may be a model that could be looked at and considered further. And I would just like to ask more broadly in terms of the creating resilient ecosystems, what that can bounce back from the sort of devastation that we fear with the ash dieback, what the Scottish Government's strategy is on this and how that can be funded, if there is any, dare I ask, additional money in view of the concerns about a whole range of pathogens.
Certainly, if I may address both those, but I may bring in James Pendlebury on this as well. In terms of the model, I certainly very much support the process that you're describing, where local landowners and agents through Scottish Wildlife Trust and others are collecting seeds. One of the changes in tactics, if you like, in response to the fact that we now believe, unfortunately, ash dieback is widespread throughout the GB at least, and certainly now present in Northern Ireland, we're aware of as well, and that we want to protect as best we can in the short term mature trees, so we can identify where there are resilient strains of ash tree. Evidence from the continent is that 1 to 2% of trees in locations like Denmark might well be naturally resistant to this particular fungus. So we're working with local landowners and other volunteers and citizens, taking a citizen science approach is, I think, a very constructive way in which we can identify where there are signs in a stand of trees of ash dieback, but yet 1 or 2 ash trees are visibly showing resilience to the disease. Having that information then supplied to Forestry Commission Scotland and other stakeholders. Well, one of the things that was discussed at the stakeholder summit was about how do we coordinate that kind of information and provide a single point of contact. That's something we're hopefully going to give guidance on in the future. But that citizen science approach can very much help us identify where these trees are. We can collect those seeds, it's important to maintain the genetic biodiversity of a range that we can, as best we can, so we don't replace one problem with another problem and having all our future ash trees effectively developed from one set of genetics and therefore leaving them exposed to other diseases. So it's important to try and get the balance right in terms of maintaining the diversity of the genetics of our tree population, but also identify commercially viable strains of ash tree that can then supplement those. And in terms of the resilient ecosystems, I think we have put an increase in funding from Scottish Government resources from 50,000 up to 600,000 per annum through the spending review period for plant health issues. That is enabling us to do things like aircraft, helicopter surveys of forests to see whether there is evidence from the sky that can then be followed up on the ground. We're putting work into additional human resource to do that work, and I do think that you're quite rightly identifying, I think this is a challenge becoming more present as climate change impacts. Some of these diseases are having a better chance of getting a foothold in Scotland than they would have otherwise had. And so the problem is getting more severe, and I think the resources, we have increased resources here, but clearly we'll have to keep a watching eye on the scale of the challenge and respond accordingly in terms of resource. But if I can ask James maybe to comment on how we do more to make our ecosystems resilient.
Thank you, Minister and Convener. I think there are two or three, well, there's quite a few things about it going forward. The control strategy will be key in terms of managing the disease when that hopefully is issued in the next week or two in association with DEFRA and stakeholders and all the various scientists involved. I think the sector, going back to an earlier point, the sector in terms of the nursery trade is already working with others on breeding for resistance, what the issues are, how we could breed for resistance. The science indicates that ash actually has a fairly broad genetic base. It's not like elm, which was almost clonal, why elm was so vulnerable to Dutch elm disease, whereas the pest at the moment seems to have quite a narrow genetic base. So there might be some hope in that. And the resistance, the indication from Denmark is that any resistance in ash is highly heritable. So actually there's a really good chance we might be able to breed for resistance. In terms of managing the future crop, in terms of ash, it's about trying to maintain as many trees as we can, I think, for quite a long period of time. If you felled them all, then you've got nothing to breed from. So I mean, it sounds basic, but it's quite fundamental. I think in terms of going forward, it's about diversifying the forestry crop that we put on the ground, alternative species. It's about management strategies. For some of the diseases like Dothystroma, there's evidence that if you open up the crop quite a bit, you thin it, you actually get airflow through the crop, it actually reduces the incidence of the disease. So there are management strategies that can be developed for various crops and various diseases. So it's going to be a blend of maintaining what we can of the current diversity, thinking about the future alternative species that will actually provide some of the habitats, the specialist habitats. Scottish Wildlife Trust actually raised that in the stakeholder meeting with the Minister. It's a very good point in terms of how do we maintain that ecological diversity. So I think it's just a range of things that have to be brought to the table in terms of advice and information. And on future management strategies, for example, we've been working with stakeholders, both arboriculturalists, nursery, forest managers, to look at how do we manage ash in the wider environment to deal with the disease as it's currently out there. So it's just a range of different factors we'd have to bring to bear.
Dick, Lyle, and then Margaret McDougall.
Good morning, Minister and gentlemen. I had a number of questions, but I refer to the paper which the Forestry Commission have issued to us from November 2012. Certainly answered quite a lot of the questions I had, and can I say, Minister, I've been quite impressed with the action that you've taken in the last couple of weeks and the knowledge that you have gained in regard to this subject. But can I turn to, and I think it refers back to a question that Alec Ferguson asked. Timber production, to my mind, is a very important sector in Scotland. What would you say is now being done to assess the impact of all tree diseases on timber production in Scotland?
Well, I think as we've indicated earlier on, that it was one of, I suppose, the issues that came up in the stakeholder summit was what I think it was a legitimate point to make. Why does it sort of, in some respects, why does it take a sort of a crisis like ash dieback to bring us together as government, stakeholders, environmental NGOs all together in one room? I think it was a very productive meeting. I think going forward, I think we need to try and maintain that kind of communication with the sector, ensure that as diseases such as Dothystroma and Phytophthora sort of become, our understanding of how to strategise to tackle them sort of improves, in the point that James Pendlebury was making as well, in terms of improved forestry practices to minimise the risk perhaps of it spreading by thinning and allowing the airflow to go through the woodlands more effectively. As we gain understanding, that we communicate that out to the sector in a kind of in a very kind of channeled and focused way, rather than allowing it to happen sort of drip feeds, through websites and things. If we can keep that stakeholder engagement up, maintain communication with all those interested parties on a kind of a more organised basis going forward, I think that will help. But clearly, you're right. very much right that these diseases, because of their potential significance and the potential impact on individual tree species, whether it's larch in the case of Phytophthora ramorum, or we have threat to sort of native juniper trees, which maybe not commercially of commercial interest, but certainly have a very important role in our ecosystem. We have the Dothostroma, which is a particular worry, I think, given that we have a unique native species in the case of Scots pine, which is threatened by it. So we're clearly very concerned to ensure that that one is given a high priority. That we, pick up on Claudia Beamish's point that we provide adequate resource to have a response to plant health issues, but that we have the communication of the information that helps industry improve its practices. Clearly the points have been made earlier on about imports as well. We have to reduce the risk of import material damaging our commercially important sector and also our native woodlands. So I'm not sure whether either David Howat or James Pendlebury want to come in any specifics about the scale of the threat to the disease.
Perhaps I could just add a little bit, Minister, if that's all right. I mean, essentially, where it's most serious at the moment in Scotland in terms of impact on timber is with this Dothostroma needle bite on pine. And what, particularly on lodgepole pine, where if the crop is left for too long, you actually get it turning more or less into sawdust in the forest. So what Forest Enterprise has done, and what we're now encouraging the private sector to do, is to do, if you like, forward surveying, so that they can get into those crops and do the harvesting while there's still harvestable timber to come out of it. And so that's the action that's been taken on that. And the Phytophthora in the larch so far isn't really having a significant impact on timber production, but clearly there's worry it will. It's advanced a lot more down in southwest England, so we're learning lessons from southwest England about impacts on the larch market. But as I explained earlier, really the whole job of this, or part of the job of this Scottish Market Impacts Group, is to look at implications of tree health on timber production. But that's against the background of a very detailed forecast of softwood availability that was published earlier in the year, which actually shows that, putting aside the tree health problems, we've actually got quite a good story to tell in terms of rising production in Scotland. And it's not just tree health you've got to think about. You've got to think about issues of accessibility for timber transport, owners' motivations and so forth. So really the role of that group is to get their heads around the whole picture in terms of where we're going on timber availability in Scotland.
Just to come back slightly, to take it from what has now been learned from this instance, that we will continue to monitor and to ensure that the tree production is safeguarded, and also that any disease is highlighted quickly.
Absolutely, Convener. I do agree with that. When I was referring to the fact we need to improve communication going forward, I wouldn't want to keep having meetings of stakeholders without having any defined purpose, but I think one thing that did come out of that meeting was a sense that we need to have perhaps a more going forward, that there was a value in that kind of meeting, and that might be replicated to look at wider tree health issues and to engage with the likes of the Scottish Timber Markets group that was referred to by David Howat. So, bringing people together in that way, I thought was a very effective way of communicating the main scientific messages, and Dr. Pendlebury gave a very helpful presentation on what the symptoms of that particular disease look like in the case of Callara ash dieback. And I think a similar sort of process of engagement with industry, if there's another threat such as Dothostroma, to have a similar level of advice, right, what are we taking action on specifically in relation to this disease? How can we, government and industry, through interactions with things like SRDP, how can we change our procedures so that we can address the challenges faced by this disease and react to it? So I think the approach that was taken there, I think, was valued by stakeholders, and I think it could be replicated for other situations that arise going forward. Hopefully there won't be many of them, but unfortunately I fear, as I said earlier, because of climate change, that we're going to have a more conducive environment for pests to affect our commercially valuable timber industry.
Claudia, briefly, then Margaret McDougall, on this point.
Sorry, it's not on this point.
Oh, well, Margaret was first in the queue then.
Okay. I'm actually going to ask a question around the imports in the private sector. In recent years, we've seen a huge increase in the variety of trees that we can buy in garden centres. I just wondered what restrictions and checks are put in place for the likes of garden centres to ensure that they're not importing disease with these plants and trees.
Well, first of all, just sort of highlight that obviously whether there are import restrictions or not is currently a reserved matter, so we have to work through DEFRA and through UK authorities, which we are doing constructively and giving our views on these issues. We have made suggestions about looking at the and looking at future scenarios that Dick Lyle has just referred to. That there might need to be an examination of what the implications of sort of wider sort of import restrictions on different species might be, and that's something that we're keen to engage with DEFRA on. But if I can maybe bring in David Howat on the current regulatory environment on nurseries and the sale of horticultural products, that would be helpful.
Essentially, we work very much within the context of the EU plant health regime, which again is sort of international hierarchy that sits under the International Plant Protection Convention. And then you've got links with the World Trade Organization. So essentially what you've got is you've got this tension, if you like, on the one hand of us wanting to protect ourselves against imported pathogens, and on the other hand you've got the principles of Europe, of free trade within Europe, and that's the tension that exists there. But within that EU plant health regime, there are possibilities for member states and parts of member states to determine disease-free areas and all the rest of it, to impose various plant passporting regimes. And within Scotland, the setup is that within the Scottish Government, there's, sitting in the Rural Payments Inspection Directorate, there's what they call the HMU, Horticultural Marketing Unit, and they actually go out and they carry out physical inspections of nurseries. So that's basically the control that operates there. But part of the meeting I was referring to earlier on Monday was what I'm very keen we do in Scotland is we make sure we have a really good sort of, it's pretty good anyway, but really make sure we have a joined-up approach as between what we in the Forestry Commission do for forest trees and what our colleagues in ARPID do and other parts of the Scottish Government do in respect of, as you say, the ornamentals and stuff which come into nurseries.
Centres.
And garden centres, yes.
Yeah.
That's good. Nigel, Don?
Thank you, Convener. I just wanted to pick up on something that the Minister, I thought, heard the Minister say earlier about how we do this survey, because I was concerned that if you get people out on foot, then they're very close to the scene of the crime, the leaf, but they can't go very far. I think I heard the Minister suggest something about aerial surveying, and I'm just wondering whether you could say a bit more about that. Presumably that's not about people in helicopters looking, but maybe that's about cameras and computer analysis, and that sounds actually quite exciting.
That may be proved correct. I'll maybe check with Dr. Pendlebury and David Howat, but my understanding is not purely just someone sitting at a window of a plane flying over looking for damage. It is more scientific than that in terms of recording aerial photography and then obviously inspecting that to see if there's any damage. But if I can maybe just check that with James Pendlebury and David Howat.
Actually, in fact, Convener, what we find the most efficient way to use helicopters is actually getting a trained eye into the helicopter. And we've only got, part of the challenge we're getting is to get more of those trained eyes. We're relying on sort of 2 or 3 people, but it's particularly that Phytophthora that you need someone who's in there who can really sort of spot the early signs of the disease. And in a day's flight, if it's well planned, they can cover large parts of, say Galloway and going further up the west coast. So they take geo-referenced photographs. So they take photographs, they're geo-referenced, and that means that then you can have the surveyors who go in and do the ground truthing. Now, obviously, there is also the potential of developing remote sensing and all the rest of it, which you say is very exciting. The one thing that, in terms of looking at aerial photographs, if you just had aerial photographic cover, you would then need people to spend a very long time going through lots and lots of aerial photographs to try and identify signs of the disease, whereas what we found is at the moment, it's a very efficient way of getting a helicopter run, say getting that trained eye into the helicopter, and they can very quickly home in on where there seems to be evidence of Phytophthora or something else.
Confirm, Convener, that what we've always known, which is this very little beats Mark 1 number eyeball.
I've been trying to bring in Claire Baker, but other colleagues keep coming up with questions. And Claudia is the next person, please.
Thank you, Convener. It's two quite specific questions, really building on what other members have asked. And the first is from an issue that's been highlighted to me by the Woodland Trust in Scotland about the fear of a spread of Phytophthora from larch to native oak. And I'm just wondering if there's any comment on that, if that is a concern, so we can possibly try and be ahead of the game on this one, if there is a concern. And also, in terms of the range of species with ash, which I think in Latin is Fraxinus, there seem to be a whole range of possibilities, and I'm wondering how the scientists are going to be able to balance whether it's appropriate, having had our discussion about local seed, to import, for instance, the Excelsior seed, which is shown to be resistant to the dieback, or whether we can develop, you've pointed out there can be ways of developing resistance within Scotland, but I wonder if you could comment on both those two issues, or if your colleagues could.
What I may do, Convener, I'll direct the question on Phytophthora to James Pendlebury, if that would be okay. But on the second question, in terms of range of species, I think there is at least one other strain of ash, I think, is it Americana, that's also resistant. So, but clearly, from an ecological point of view, there'd be major advantages if we can identify native exemplar trees, if you like, which are showing resistance, and propagate from those rather than to bring in an imported species. But if I can ask James Pendlebury to address the question about the transference of Phytophthora to oak trees.
The Phytophthora ramorum, I mean, as everyone knows, is called sudden oak death syndrome because in America it kills American oak, particularly where there's a laurel kind of understory. The early discoveries of ramorum in the UK and the southwest of England was mainly affecting beech, and even in mixed woodlands and so on, oak seemed in the UK to be reasonably unaffected by Phytophthora ramorum. To be honest, it was a bit of a surprise to everybody that it managed to jump from affecting hardwoods into larch. There was no evidence in the literature that that would occur. So I wouldn't say there's any complacency, but the evidence we have to date is that oak is relatively unaffected in the UK by Phytophthora ramorum, but we're keeping a weather eye on it. In relation to, if I may, your question about the species selection, it's probably stating the obvious, but it's about site, it's about what you want from the site, what you want from the forest that you're creating. There are lots of alternatives to ash that could be planted that are native. For example, alder if it's a river situation and so on. There are limitations. Some of the alternatives like sycamore are pretty vulnerable to grey squirrel damage. So there are various factors you'd have to take into account in terms of what you wanted to do. So there are alternative species choices, and those have been discussed with the sector at present. In terms of breeding from resistance, I would hope that if we get a coherent breeding for resistance programme together across the UK, that we'll be picking up trees throughout the environment that have a degree of resistance that we can breed from. Obviously, you'd track them, you'd trace them, you know where their origin is. It might be we have to sacrifice that we can't have the tree from the glen, but we can have it from a neighbouring strath if we get the resistance. That's without being glib. It'll just depend on where we pick up, if you like, trees that we can breed resistance from, and then there'll be a management decision as to whether that's acceptable or not in terms of a particular site.
Thank you. That's those answered. Claire Baker, please.
Thank you very much, Convener. I very much appreciate the opportunity to take part this morning. I very much welcome the Minister's comments this morning and the amount of activity described in relation to tackling ash disease in Scotland. But I think you will recognise that there were concerns around the delay in terms of when it was identified at UK level, identified in Scotland in July, and yet the summit didn't happen until November. And I do appreciate the Minister has only been in the job since September, so he might give him some cover on that issue. I think the delay led to a degree of confusion, and it's been good that the Minister has recognised that this morning in terms of the way in which he will communicate with stakeholders. When I met with stakeholders prior to the summit, they were largely receiving their information from the media, which we know isn't always the most reliable source, and also had concerns around the way in which the public were informed of the threat. when I checked the Forestry Commission website, it wasn't until the end of October, the very beginning of November, until there was a kind of public advice notice up. That was post the question from John Scott. So I do have concerns about the way in which the public were engaged and the way in which Parliament was engaged. But looking forward, particularly in terms of public awareness and parliamentary involvement, as we look forward to spring and summer, which might seem quite far away at the moment in Scotland, but spring and summer, the area of greatest infection risk, how do we improve? I think David Howat said we can learn lessons from what's happened. That would suggest there have been mistakes, and how do we improve as we look forward to spring and summer?
Well, certainly, if I could start with the last point, I think with a response to a pest crisis like this, that you will learn lessons. From my view, from outside Forestry Commission Scotland and the work that has been done, I've been very impressed with, in the short time that I have been a minister, with the urgency that was given within Forestry Commission Scotland. So I wouldn't want to give the impression that I'm in any way critical of the work done. Indeed, I'm very grateful for the sacrifices people made in terms of their personal life, giving up a weekend to do the rapid response survey. So I'm very grateful to the staff for the effective way in which they went around that. Having said that, we clearly will do a kind of a post-match analysis and work out where there are areas that we can improve on, because, as has been mentioned by a number of members, and Richard Lyle addressed it as well most recently, this is one of many pests which affect our woodlands and our commercial forestry sector, and therefore we have to learn, make sure that the process, if you like, is honed as we go forward and becomes more effective. I think in terms of the communication, clearly the forest research staff, Forestry Commission staff were working full pelt on the rapid survey, and so there maybe was a difficulty in terms of doing engagement other than through websites and press releases, and that was probably the most effective way, just getting the message out quickly. And obviously we had an input to those press releases, but certainly if there are points there, I accept if there are stakeholders outside who are saying they wanted information earlier than that, we'll learn from that and try and ensure that that doesn't happen again. But certainly I think the stakeholder meeting was very effective. I think that is a useful vehicle for continuing to engage with people and give them the opportunity to interact with the experts, and not just with the minister, but clearly with the expertise that we had around the table in terms of science and the forestry management practices. They were able to ask them the questions they needed to ask about, well, what do we do if we find a tree on our estate? What do we advise people to do if they're walking in our forests? Do we mark areas off and stop people walking through them? So all those kind of questions, it was a really good opportunity, I think, for everyone from RSPB and SWT and others on an NGO side of things, but also the commercial forestry sector, to interrogate myself, interrogate my advisors and officials, and get that information out in the way that they needed it. So if I take a lesson from this, I think that process was very helpful to me to engage with them, but also helpful, I think, to them to engage with the experts around the table. So I will certainly try and use that approach. Perhaps towards the spring, we might have another meeting in advance of the new growing season for trees to sort of say, right, what are we going to be looking for in terms of the symptoms, sort of update our knowledge as to where the presence of this particular disease is, and we can also at that meeting perhaps address some of the other tree pests that we're aware of and give advice on what other things that they should be looking for when they're doing their own inspections. So I think that's certainly a big lesson I've taken from it, that's a useful vehicle and maybe one that we should use more often.
Thank you for that. Looking at the map which we have of Killara Fraxinia, it shows basically that the wider environment is infected, particularly in the southeast of England and in a small corridor up to Fife on the east coast, and that the vast number of other noted areas where it's been found have been recently planted sites. That means that in the bulk of Britain, we're actually seeing recent plantings as being the identified issue about spread. We know from what you've said that there's also potential of the airborne issue into the nearest areas to the continent. But I think it would be useful for all of us if we got some more of an update in the spring before it comes to the period where we're talking about the actions that need to be taken. And then just summing up from what people have said, this is an ongoing issue where obviously there's a developing knowledge, and it's very useful for members to be involved in arboriculture to make sure that we don't forget that that's an important part of our duties to the rural environment. So I would like to thank the Minister very much for that, and we'll try and make a date with you and your officials at some time which is appropriate when you've had the next report. Thank you for coming, and we'll have a short recess before we look at the Aquaculture and Fisheries Bill in the next item. Okay, we will start the agenda item 4, Aquaculture and Fisheries Scotland Bill. This is our first evidence session on the bill, where we will hear from officials on the content of the bill and the associated documents. It is not for officials to answer questions on the policy decisions, rather to offer clarification on the content of the bill and associated documents. Discussions on the policy aspects should be left for the Minister. We will hear from stakeholders throughout December, with a final session in the new year with the Minister. So we intend to look at this in some considerable detail. I would welcome the officials to our meeting just now. Willie Cowan, Deputy Director of Performance, Aquaculture and Recreational Fisheries. Alastair Mitchell, Head of Aquaculture Unit, and Jeff Gibbons, the Aquaculture and Fisheries Bill Team Leader. And invite questions from members just now. To kick off, the policy memorandum states that one of the primary purposes of the bill is to effectively manage the interactions of farmed and wild fisheries. How do farmed fisheries currently interact with wild fisheries, and what are the implications for their sustainable economic development?
Well, they clearly interact with each other by virtue of being in the same place. The activity of fish farming takes place in both freshwater and the marine environment, and that is where obviously the wild fish stocks live. So there is an interaction simply by virtue of being neighbours. There is a regulatory framework in place now which manages the siting of fish farms and considers the implications around the individual siting of farms in various places. There is an inspection regime undertaken by Marine Scotland on fish health, and a further monitoring regime undertaken by SEPA in relation to discharges into the marine environment.
So we're starting from a position where there is a framework of regulation which is operative at the present time. So in the absence of the bill, what would be the implications for wild fisheries of increasing aquaculture production in accordance with the government's targets?
There is a regulatory framework which is in place and is working well, and we have a successful aquaculture industry which has been growing over the last decade or so. The purpose of this bill is to take us to the next stage. So the government supports the industry's ambitions to grow the aquaculture industry. There is policy pressures coming from the European Commission in the form of the Common Fisheries Policy, which clearly wants to increase aquaculture production across the EU in order, well, at least in part, to reduce the importation of fish products from other parts of the world, so to become more self-sufficient on the one hand, and on the other hand to contribute to global food production, which is clearly an issue for a rising population and limited land resources upon which to grow protein.
So what are the implications for wild fisheries then from that, as I was saying?
The implications of growth?
Of aquaculture on wild fisheries?
Well, wherever there is an industrial input, there has to be an impact of some sort. As you have seen from the written evidence that you've been provided, and I understand you've been around and about visiting various stakeholders, and you'll be aware of media reports. There are differing interpretations upon actual and perceived impacts upon wild fisheries from aquaculture. One of the issues that the government is keen to progress or to ensure is that the impacts, any impacts that there are managed and mitigated to an acceptable level. I think a key issue for the committee in your evidence consideration is the extent to which there is actual impacts as opposed to perceived impacts, and what the evidence base is for that.
On the basis of anecdotal evidence from a netsman on the north coast, he has caught somewhere in the region of 100 salmon in the last year, which were originally from an aquaculture source. That is an impact on wild salmon, as you know, monitored by a netsman. Presumably, it may have a similar impact in rivers.
The issue of the impact of escaped farm salmon on wild stocks has been the subject of a recent study, which found there to be no evidence of a substantial impact from one to the other, but there continues to be concerns about integration, about mixed breeding, about farmed animals essentially taking up the space that wild fish are in. And it's one of the key issues for government and reflected in the bill, which is to reduce any potential impact on wild fisheries from aquaculture, and one of the key ways to do that is to keep the fish in the cage, and that's one of the key issues behind the technical standard provisions in the bill. And indeed, it's one of the key issues for the aquaculture industry as a whole, because every fish that escapes is an economic loss to them.
I mean, it is the fact that that same netsman only caught 6 fish in the previous year, which had come from escapes. So it would suggest that, in fact, there is an urgency for these technical measures to work.
Yes, I think if we can provide you with data of escapes over the last decade, and we'll see that, generally speaking, these escapes have reduced considerably. There was a single issue last year during Christmas storms where a whole fish farm in Shetland was washed away. I had very interesting conversations with the then Minister on Hogmanay as to what we were going to do about this. But one of the issues there was that 300,000 fish escaped in inverted commas, but we simply do not know how many of them actually escaped live into the wild environment. So that skews the understanding behind the numbers. But it is clearly in everybody's interest to reduce escapes from aquaculture.
Okay, well, we'll be moving on to some of the different parts of the bill in a minute, but another question related to the policy memorandum from Graham Day.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, gentlemen. Could you outline for us why new legislation is necessary to achieve the purpose of the bill as it's outlined in the policy memorandum, when, for example, the 2007 Act provides for a statutory code of practice on aquaculture? Could the provisions in the bill not have been achieved through amending or replacing that code?
Some of it could have, but the view from ministers to date is that they preferred to have the industry have its own code, and for that code to be flexible and updated, as opposed to a statutory code which by its nature can come out of date very quickly. So it could have been done that way, but the preference, as I say, was for the industry code to continue, but for statutory requirements in terms of how aspects of that code should be used to be introduced. And that's where the farm management area comes in, which essentially requires fish farms to have a farm management agreement or a statement. In most cases just now, the similar arrangements happen voluntarily. But the issue that the government wanted to cover was to make sure that they happened in every instance in order to protect the whole industry and indeed the broader environment.
Okay. We'll move on to the sustainable development issues. Claudia Beamish.
To you all. The assessment of sustainable development in the policy memorandum has been criticised from some of the evidence that the committee has received, the written evidence that we've received. In evidence to the committee, Professor Colin Reid, who is environmental law professor at Dundee University, states, and if I may just read that, because I think it's helpful perhaps to have that, on the record. The assessment of the impact of the Bill for Sustainable Development is woefully inadequate. Surely many of the Bill's provisions will have a much more profound economic, social and environmental impact, especially for rural communities. The inadequacy of the consideration of sustainable development is a widespread failing. It does seem to be a real lost opportunity that the Parliament is not using this device as a means of thinking carefully about what measures we pass today will mean for the future. Now, this is obviously one person's assessment who is at Dundee University, but I quote it just to highlight the question to yourselves, please, which is the assessment of sustainable development in the policy memorandum fulfilling its potential as a means of assessing environmental, social and economic impacts of the Bill's provisions and their alternatives?
Well, clearly, ministers consider that the policy memorandum and the other documents do indeed cover that area. I think the one of the issues, around this whole area is what is sustainability, and from the Bill's perspective, we recognise, or the minister's position is that they want to encourage a sustainable growing industry, which minimises the impact on the broader marine environment. I think that it's a byproduct of getting that right, which is the economic benefits to local communities, for jobs, for income, for cohesion. But in terms of the specific issue which concerns most people, I think, in the stakeholders community, which is growth environmentally sustainable? I think ministers would say that the documents which accompanied the bill were perfectly adequate.
Could you expand on that, please? In what way could you bring to the committee's attention in what way that has been analysed in relation to the bill, so that I can understand how that's happened? How's that? You say ministers believe it. It's obviously for the minister to explain that in some detail, but it would be helpful if I could understand, as the person asking that question, how that process has been analysed in relation to the bill, because there have been concerns raised, and particularly in view of the fact that the National Marine Plan is delayed until 2014, and we've got it. We have to see all this in the context of the EU Marine Strategy Directive. Yep. I'm puzzled as to why a professor at Dundee University, to quote but one person, would raise these concerns.
But okay, I think I'm right in saying that the individual in question has raised these concerns in relation to other bills and other accompanying memoranda. So it's not specific to aquaculture and fisheries. But the issue for ministers, and the National Marine Plan is a good starting point. As you say, it has been delayed, and we hope to get a draft or the next draft of the National Marine Plan published in the new year. But that essentially sets the baseline for development in the marine environment, of which aquaculture and wild fisheries are part. And the question for the bill is to ensure that sustainability, the sustainable growth of aquaculture, can happen over a period of time. So I don't think that the bill is I don't think the bill or the accompanying memoranda say for sure that by passing the legislation which is proposed, that sustainable growth is in any way guaranteed. What it's saying is that in order to ensure that growth is sustainable over the period of time to 2020 initially, which is where the targets that the government support are timed, and it will be included in the Marine Plan also, that this gives us the opportunity to enhance the existing framework to ensure that in a staged basis that the aquaculture industry can grow sustainably. If at any point in that process the evidence is that there are issues with the sustainability of that growth, then the opportunity comes in to address those issues at that time.
Okay. Thank you. Jim Hume.
Yes, thank you, Convener. Good morning, gentlemen. The Convener's already mentioned a potential clash. He mentioned an example up in the far north. I represent the far south. And we just have to look at the Galloway Fisheries Trust, and the Nith Fisheries, Tweed Foundation, Tweed Forum. We've all been doing a huge amount of work for the wild fisheries. And that's not just environmental work, but that's also economic work that's recognised that these are largely large economic drivers in very rural areas.
Absolutely.
So there is a concern, obviously, that not just environment may be damaged, but economics also, and not just with perhaps escapees, but with unintended consequences, perhaps like sea lice, etc., being spread from fish farms. How much of these sort of economic, environmental and social impacts have been taken into account for this bill, and how has this informed the development of the bill?
I think excuse me, at its most basic level, the government's purpose is sustainable economic growth. So everything that government does and civil servants do to support government is viewed through that lens. So ministers recognise absolutely the economic benefits that come from wild fisheries, and ministers want to see those benefits enhanced. So government have been quite clear that aquaculture growth is not an end in itself, and the protection of wild fisheries is not an end in itself. These are two issues where the sectors share the same space very often, but not completely. But both sectors and consideration of the issues and the impacts and the interactions between both sectors need to be considered hand in hand. And I think it's reasonably clear that the aquaculture industry has, in some instances, but some well-publicised instances, been very supportive of the work of some of the boards and some of the trusts in the wild fisheries field, and that's part, I think, of their wider social responsibilities. But ministers want to ensure that, in this circumstance, largely rural and coastal areas thrive, and that they thrive from a mix of industry and activity, none of which detracts from Scotland's selling point, which is prime, clean environment and waters. So everything is viewed through that prism.
And just thanks. Just to follow up with that, we'll share that view, of course. But specifically, what negative impacts were identified in the work you've done so far that could potentially happen? I mean, I've maybe mentioned sea lice and escapees, but are there other negative impacts that you've identified?
There are, as I said before, there are risks in any activity. The two issues that you've outlined there, I think, are two of the key issues for the aquaculture industry to continue to work on and to get better at. There is evidence and there has been research around the world which takes a view or postulates a position as regards actual impacts on wild fisheries from aquaculture. That's evidence that we look at carefully, and it helps us to both address or develop our policy position, but also enables us to develop more broadly the management position and the regulatory position on the back of that. So there are risks, there are absolutely risks, but I think the issue for government and the broader government which manages and regulates the aquaculture industry is to ensure that those risks are properly managed and mitigated.
Just to push the point and trying to get a specific answer, what other specific risks? I mean, it was myself that gave the two risks. Were there other specific risks that you have identified in your research so far?
Well, the two that you've identified are the key risks. There are other potential risks of disease more broadly. And again, the management of disease falls into the Fish Health Inspectorate's regime and part of the regulatory regime that we manage at the minute.
Thank you. Turning to the issue of delegated powers, I think Dick Lyle wants to ask you a question.
Good morning, gentlemen. I don't have a problem with the bill. At the end of the day, it's amending the Fisheries Act 1981, which is 31 years old. Some of us are older than that. But I do have a problem with the Delegated Powers Memorandum. Can I ask you, if I'm permitted, and you may say that it really is for the Minister to answer, but the bill introduces many delegated powers and has been criticised by stakeholders. Ministers are given almost open-ended enabling powers. It has been suggested that some provisions should be dealt through primary rather than secondary legislation. So why is it there's a strong resilience on secondary implemented legislation in the bill? Why is that?
The primary reason that ministers are seeking these enabling powers is the technical nature of the provisions which will be ultimately implemented. So ministers are seeking delegated powers or enabling powers, on the back of which, even now, further consultation is underway with stakeholders on what the implementation of those enabling powers would look like. So I don't think it's unusual for enabling powers to be used to implement something like technical standards, where by its nature it is very technical, and indeed it can move apace and require further amendment. So I think on balance, at this point in time, ministers think that the balance between primary legislation and enabling powers is right, but the fallback is that each of these enabling powers would undergo a further round of detailed technical consultation with stakeholders prior to coming back to the Parliament for consideration.
So do you think that we're going to cover every section which needs an enabling power, or we're going to have a get out of jail clause?
So I don't follow the question.
Yeah, and you're going to cover every enabling power, or is it going to be open-ended?
No, I think that the enabling powers that are being sought are quite specific. Right. And the policy position from ministers is that these enabling powers will be used when it is appropriate and when the detailed consultation development work has been undertaken and we actually have a detailed product that we bring back to the Parliament and say the purpose of this detailed secondary legislation is X, Y and Z, and this is all the work that's been done to support it. But there's no suggestion of a single enabling power in order to introduce sweeping regulation.
Okay, thanks.
Nigel Don and then Claudia
Very much,
Beamish.
good morning, gentlemen. On that very point, I'm looking at section 3, and if I put 3.1a together with 3.2a, I'm left with the impression that's about technical requirements for the containment of fish. Most of what I've seen written down suggests that has to do with materials for the pens and nets and that kind of thing. I'm very conscious, as other members are, that there are lots of what I might describe as pots, pans, pumps and pipe work, and there's all sorts of other stuff out there. In the limit, I suppose some fish are even transferred in plastic containers and buckets in the limit. Don't want to trivialise it, but is there, pardon me, is there intended to be any limit on the technical stuff, or is that section intended to be all-encompassing in the context of how fish are actually kept on a farm, please?
In relation to the technical standards, excuse me, this has been developed over a number of years through a subgroup of the Ministerial Group on Aquaculture, which bringing in the industry, the gear manufacturers, the vets, the insurance companies. So it's been developed and it continues to be developed with a broad church of people who are ultimately involved in making this happen. The extent to which the detail of a technical standard should apply, I think we'll come back to in the consultation. But I take the point that the end-to-end production from initial eggs up until you harvest is very long, it's very complicated, and it covers essentially a 2-year process. So what we want to do, what ministers want to do, is to put in place a technical standard that provides consistency of approach across the industry, but is relevant to individual locations where these farms are. But I think ministers would not want this to be essentially a detailed Bible that the industry had to follow step by step by step.
If I could just add to that, the primary purpose of the conversations with the industry and other stakeholders is largely in the area of equipment in relation to the prevention of escapes. I hope that's...
I think I'm understanding that, but if I might pursue this, because I'm grateful for Mr. Cowan, it is from egg to finished fish. I guess what I'm just trying to check up here is whether you believe that what's written down here is wide enough, and it seems to me that it is, actually, if it were necessary, to prescribe the tray on which the egg is first placed to hatch. I'm just asking whether that's the intention. That would make perfectly good sense. I'm not suggesting that everything in the bill or necessarily everything that happens out there should be regulated, but merely is it wide enough to cover that should it be necessary?
Can I answer? Yes, please.
I think we would move on the basis of risk if that's the essence of the question. The Code of Good Practice has elements, and we're not in the game, or it's not the intention to micromanage the farming of these fish. But clearly, as with all the other elements of the kind of incremental sort of approach that we're taking to this, if there was a risk identified, then clearly we would discuss that with the industry and consider how we would, deal with that.
Is it on delegated powers, Claudia Beamish?
Could I ask, in relation specifically to the other issue that you've highlighted as a risk on sea lice, why I believe it is that all the councils in the aquaculture zone and SEPA and environmental NGOs and other stakeholders had favoured publication of sea lice data at an individual farm level. And I'm wondering how one might be able to take those concerns forward, because it is obviously one of the big risks. If this isn't put into legislation, which, for instance, the Salmon Fisheries Board has asked for the issue of sea lice to be actually in the bill itself, how the wider communities and the angling associations and others in rural areas can be reassured about this issue. And I can't understand, on the back of that, why it is necessary for that information at a farm level to be commercially secret. So if you could sort of perhaps expand on those issues that I've tried to highlight, please.
Okay. The first point is that there are powers in the 2007 Act for ministers to require the provision of environmental data. So new primary legislation is not required. Ministers have taken the view, after discussions with stakeholders, that there should be greater disaggregation of sea lice data than is currently available. And the SSPO last week published an article on their website indicating that from 1st of January 13, the disaggregation of sea lice data would move probably to somewhere between 25 and 30 areas around Scotland as opposed to the current 6. So ministers are supportive of that further disaggregation, but recognise that in some instances there are commercially confidential reasons why further disaggregation may not be beneficial to the industry in terms of their responsibilities as PLCs.
On the consultation stuff, which I think you could come back to, because it isn't just about the delegated powers part that we were discussing. And indeed, I think Alec Ferguson was going to look at some of these points. So it might be an idea if we did that and then see if there's a point that was brought up from that in that section, to give Alec Ferguson a chance to ask a similar question.
Thank you very much indeed. Good morning, gentlemen. I wonder if we could talk about the consultation process for a little bit. Obviously, the pre-legislative consultation, I think it received a total of 1,342 responses, of which it was deemed that 1,193 were sort of essentially lumped together under interest group responses. And I just wonder, that's a lot of voices, even if it was people just signing a pro forma document who had something to say about this bill. So I wondered if you could perhaps just expand a little on how those voices have been taken into account before the legislation was tabled.
Jeff, to respond.
Sure.
That was certainly an issue that we discussed with stakeholders prior to the consultation actually being put forward and analysed, so they're aware of the methodology adopted, which is common across the Scottish Government. And we were very, very clear that we recognised that a lot of the responses, while they were tick the box exercises, many, they were actually registering a view that we did take on board, and that was reflected in not only the accompanying documentation, but in the way we decided that as part of our response to the consultation, we would provide further detail about how we would deal with those issues that weren't going to be progressed through the bill, might be progressed through enabling powers that we already had, or indeed through voluntary means.
Are you able to give any examples of some issues that were raised under interest group responses that have been included in the bill?
That have been included?
Yeah.
Well, indeed, it's more about addressing some of the concerns that those had. There was two particular issues, I think, that were quite prominent in the responses. One was concerns around fixed penalty notices and issues around the application and the process being applied and the rationale for that policy initiative. And secondly, the discussion around strict liability. And in many ways, the responses that we received merged the two proposals together, which actually, I think was self-evident that it was confusing, the response that we got. The responses we got in terms of concerns about strict liability and its applicability and the policy rationale enabled us to reflect on whether the existing powers we had were sufficient, whether there's evidence to suggest that they weren't working in practice, and indeed on that basis we took the decision, the ministers took the decision that there was no case to progress that. So that was one action. In terms of fixed penalty notices, the vast majority were concerned about this application and the process. And following further discussion, we put out a very detailed notice on the fixed penalties in terms of explaining the process. Whilst acknowledging concerns about the policy rationale, it explained how it would work in practice, which alleviated some of the concerns that were raised.
So despite the fact that these responses have not been included in the consultation analysis, you can put out the message that it is not a waste of time responding in that way, because I think it's important people know that.
Absolutely, and indeed we were very clear and wanted to be absolutely sure that in terms of the fixed penalty notices, that the actual additional documentation that we produced got out to the individuals rather than to representative bodies, to make sure that message was being absolutely got through and understood.
Well, if we could then turn to the sort of the key issues that were raised and have been included in the analysis and indeed in the drafting of the bill, can you talk me through the process by which the government have decided not to take forward issues in the bill, some of these key issues? Can you, I mean, Claudia has already mentioned, as we've already identified, one of the major negative impacts of fish farming is sea lice, and it seems to me that the opportunity has been passed by to include a number of provisions in the bill on, for instance, collecting data on sea lice, on deaths and on movements of fish, and powers to prescribe lower sea lice thresholds. That seems to have been passed by, and yet I would imagine that there was a considerable amount of response to consultation on those issues. Can you just talk me through that process?
Certainly, we, in response to in acknowledgement of the number of responses we got around the various proposals within the consultation, and I think it was self-evident that many individuals who took the time to respond to that weren't clear that actually that the proposals weren't in relation to just primary legislation, and that was one of the issues we needed to actually get across. There was some confusion about that there was a natural progression for the proposals that we were talking about would move to primary legislation. Some of the questions were how we would take it forward in terms of the existing powers that we had, or indeed whether we needed to use existing powers and whether we could do it through alternative means, the kind of level of data we might require. As a consequence of that, we thought it was appropriate to use in summer period to actually engage more directly with the stakeholders, not only getting out about to establish a stakeholder reference group to explain in more detail some of the proposals, the rationale behind some of the objectives, and to more fully understand some of the responses. And I think one of the key elements for us about that was in terms of the postcard response, if you like. It didn't really give you that level of detail, but what the concerns were, it was kind of reacting in some ways to other responses we got. So we took a considerable amount of time to reflect on those provisions, and as I said earlier, one of the things we thought was important to inform the process for everybody was the additional information in terms of the consultation response, why we were not looking to, if that was the case, to progress within primary legislation, what we were looking to do as an alternative. We would signpost existing legislation where we thought we could achieve some of the objectives, and where we might be using voluntary means, which, for example, in the sea lice and the data collection, because it was about data collection in the round rather than sea lice, it was around looking to progress that in the voluntary means, in the spirit of openness and transparency, which is one of the key messages within the bill, rather than the need to actually legislate. Ministers were made it quite clear they didn't want to legislate unless they had to. And indeed, on the sea lice aspect, I think the other part of the SSPO's announcement last week was to progress the recommendations in the Healthier Fish Working Group of additional information. And that's a step forward in terms of the data going forward and people's ability to assess how that will work in practice. So I think the consultation response reflects the level of reflection that we had in terms of the original proposals.
I'll just briefly finish that just a little bit off from my point of view. Can you say that the bill as tabled to us in the form we now have it has changed much because of the consultation responses from what you originally envisaged?
And because we didn't consult on the bill. I think that was one of the issues that we had. We consulted on proposals, and I think that the initial confusion was, although it wasn't a bill in its understood form, people thought that the proposals constituted what was the bill, and that wasn't the case.
Okay, thank you for that. I'll come back to you.
That's a key point, that the bill is part of a package of approach. We've got the existing regulatory framework, we have propositions in the bill, we have if the powers are granted within the bill, we have further detailed consultation to come on secondary legislation. We have existing powers. We have existing regimes which can be used differently to achieve different outcomes. And we have the potential, where it's appropriate, for voluntary measures to be put in place instead of legislation. So the bill is part of a package, but it's not the only thing.
Okay, that's useful, thank you.
Can we move to issues regarding part one of the bill then, please, and kick off this Angus MacDonald?
Ask a question just on that last part there.
On the last part? Yes.
Just for my own personal clarification, are you saying that you're relying on voluntary information coming on sea lice and the like, rather than including it in the bill?
What we're saying is, in relation to sea lice and data generally, there are currently powers within the 2007 Act for ministers to make regulations to require data to be provided. Ministers have taken the view that no other primary legislation is required for that purpose, and that their preferred way forward is the voluntary provision of information in trying to encourage this openness and transparency, essentially between neighbours. So that's the approach that ministers have chosen to take at this point in time. But there are powers within the 2007 Act for them to come back to the Parliament and seek a regulation if that were necessary.
And is that working at the moment, voluntary data?
Well, this is the point that I and Jeff raised just a second ago, that there is a proposition out there now, which is there have obviously been discussions between government and stakeholders on what could be put in place. There is a proposition out there now which is subject to further discussion. So as stage one progresses and we get towards stage two, it will become clearer what the proposition is in terms of what will actually be provided, and stakeholders will have the opportunity to take a view on whether that is appropriate from their perspective, and then the debate will continue. So we are in the process just now, but we don't have the final product just now.
Quickly on that.
Yes.
Thank you, Convener. Could I just ask if the proposition includes the question about whether it would be more appropriate in the view of stakeholders to see the issues around sea lice and disaggregation and those issues within the bill or not?
No.
Or is that, no.
Because, as I said, there is existing primary legislation which provides powers for ministers to come back to Parliament for regulation. So from the government's perspective, there is no need for further primary legislation in order to do any of this. The issue for government and for Parliament generally is does the approach, the voluntary approach that is being advocated, provide stakeholders as a whole with a solution which is acceptable, or do we need to come back and consider this in further regulation?
It's probably worth adding to that we do welcome what the SSPO have put forward last week and see that as a very constructive development. So in that context, the kind of voluntary way forward does seem to be working, but clearly we will keep an eye on that.
Thank you. So moving to part one questions, Angus MacDonald.
Thank you, Convener. If I could turn to fish farm management, which, as we know, is in part one of the bill. And as we also know, the bill proposes to introduce a legal requirement for fish management agreements or fish management statements for all fish farms. It also provides for inspections of farms and the taking of samples or of whole fish to determine the origins of escapes. Can you tell us what the main differences between the FMAs and FMSs in the Industry Code of Practice and those proposals in the bill?
The Industry Code of Practice contains provision for farm management areas to be put in place amongst their members on a non-legislative way, if you want to put it like that. So, although the majority of production in Scotland is covered by people who are signed up to the Code of Practice, not all of it is. So what the bill seeks to do is to put that element on a statutory basis so that every fish farmer, irrespective of whether they're a member of the SSPO, is required to have an agreement or a statement, and that those statements must have, as a minimum, the items which are specified on the face of the bill. So it takes what is essentially a non-statutory basis that the majority of farmers currently sign up to, and puts it on a statutory basis which requires all fish farmers to sign up to.
If this goes through, what would be the timescale for them to sign up? Would there be a strict timescale?
Well, as with all new legislation, we have to work through what the transitional arrangements would be. But given that the majority of fish farmers currently undertake this type of arrangement, we don't anticipate that for the majority that it would be a huge burden to revise what they've got to comply with what would then be the law. And we would be working with the industry to understand what the gap would be for those farmers who currently don't have an agreement, and what the timescale would be for putting one into place. Probably at a practical level, this is about coordination of stocking, coordination of treatment, coordination of harvesting. So it probably makes sense for the requirements of the bill, should it be passed, to come into effect at the beginning of the next production cycle in each area.
Part 1 of the bill also provides for the possibility to set legal technical requirements for fish farms and for measures to be put in place to control and monitor wellboat operation. The modifications needed to wellboats were identified as some of the most significant costs in the financial memorandum. What exactly are the proposed modifications? I actually don't have that detail in front of me. And are the costs proportionate ones?
Essentially, the key aspect of the wellboat provision would be to install a filter which would stop sea lice at whatever stage of the development going back into the marine environment. So it's a filtering system. Ballpark figures that we have suggest that retrofitting wellboats could be in the order of £500,000, but each. But some wellboats have been built in recent years with the ability to retrofit this type of equipment. Others, which are a bit older, won't have the ability to retrofit equipment. And wellboats that are being developed now, and built now we're aware that in Norway some of the wellboats that are being built now are being built with this type of equipment installed. So from an environmental management position, the logic is pretty straightforward. That if you manage to capture a pest, let's not recycle it back into the environment. Let's keep it.
It would certainly make sense if they are commissioning new wellboats to have that facility on them now. Just off the top of your head, how much does a new wellboat cost if you're talking about a £500,000 modification?
I think wellboats 12 to 15 million.
So that order.
Okay. Well, hopefully we can see some of these being built in Scotland in the future, not just in Norway.
That, in terms of economic development, that would be very welcome.
If I could move on to evidence that the committee's received from Europharma, which states that contrary to implications of the policy memorandum, in Norway the genotyping methodology for traceability of farm escapes is not the only approach being taken, and Europharma actually recommend that Scotland also evaluate the alternative method being trialled there, which is physical tagging of fish. Has the Scottish Government considered this alternative to track fish farm escapees or escapes?
The Government, through Marine Scotland Science, would consider the best way of achieving the policy outcome. So what the provision in the bill is to do, is to get the specimen. The downstream, what you do with the specimen will be subject to technological advances. So this is not a one-stop shop. We'll take the specimen and we will do this and only this with it. This is, we'll take the specimen and we'll consider what the best way is of identifying where the fish came from, given what is being developed and what is in place in the market.
Thank you. Obviously, we're discussing the technicalities of the bill at the moment, and it's very useful to have your views. We'll get stakeholders' views in due course. Moving on to part 2 of the bill, and this is dealing with salmon and freshwater fisheries. Margaret McDougall to start.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, gentlemen. Part 2 deals with the salmon and freshwater fisheries, as the Convener has said, and deals with governance by district salmon fishery boards, includes provisions to allow the introduction of carcass tagging schemes and making it an offence to sell salmon which are not tagged, allows for inspectors to enter salmon fisheries to take samples of fish, tag fish, or carry out monitoring analysis, and it also looks at the conservation measures, rules on baits and lures and annual close times, and it provides the possibility for Scottish ministers to change the rules on consenting introductions under particular circumstances. Concerns have been expressed by ASFB that the details of this section of the bill were not consulted upon or agreed with by the majority of consultation respondents. Was enough information provided in the consultation on the planned provisions?
I think the consultation was largely 2 parts as regards this part of the bill. One is the improvement of management arrangements, carcass tagging, this kind of stuff, which was going into in some detail, and the other was in relation to good governance, openness, transparency in the operation of boards. Now, I think it is correct to say that the level of detail in the consultation paper was not as detailed as what has come out in the bill. But I think we struggle to identify the requirements in the bill being any more onerous than on other public bodies or bodies created by statute. So there was a general principle of how can openness, transparency, management of this sector be improved, given that they are, to all intents and purposes, public bodies or bodies created by statute, and therefore should have, the government's assertion is, should be able to display certain commitments in relation to it. So I think it's reasonable to say that we did not consult on the exact detail of every provision which is now in the bill, but consulted on the principle of good governance, openness, transparency. And I think what's come into the bill is simply reflective of what people would expect from statutory and public bodies.
I mean, have you had any follow-up from these bodies once you've given them that response?
Yes, we've got the ASFB as part of ASFD is part of the stakeholder reference group for the bill. So we've met with them both as part of the stakeholder group and separately, and we have heard the same concerns outlined to yourself. And we've also had you have had a couple of responses back from individual boards in relation to your evidence given, and I don't think there's any great concerns expressed in those returns to you. There are clearly concerns in the margins about what the practical implications are of some of these proposed provisions on some of the smaller boards. But I think in relation, I think the government's position would be that for a body which is a statutory body with a number of powers at its hand, that what is being suggested in the bill is entirely reasonable.
Continue. As part of the consultation process, was any consideration given to the proposal from Netsmen's organisations for their management to be transferred to Inshore Fisheries Group?
That didn't form part of the consultation process for this bill. But as you'll be aware, and as was stated in the policy memorandum, the government is committed to doing further work on the wild fish sector, the management arrangements for the wild fish sector, and I would anticipate that the questions about the movement of particular sectors or sectors within sectors would form part of that consultation. So we didn't specifically consult upon it, but I anticipate that it's something that government will want to take views on in the next stage of this process.
Sorry to interrupt. There is a conflict, obviously, between river fishermen and the nets fishermen, and they feel that they would be better managed within the Inshore Fisheries Group rather than under the fisheries boards. But
yes.
So why did you decide not to include that as part of the bill?
Well, the first and primary reason is that it wasn't specifically consulted on in the consultation paper last year. The basis for the consultation paper was three things. In relation to the management of the fisheries, what work had been undertaken that would enable us to come forward with propositions for legislation. So, for example, a lot of what's in the bill comes out the Mixed Stock Fisheries Working Group recommendations. So work had been undertaken which enabled us to take a view, to consult on and to come to Parliament on. The second was the issue of what could be done to improve openness openness and transparency in the operation of the boards as statutory bodies, and we consulted on that. And third was a question of the government's commitment to do more in this area within the lifetime of this Parliament. So there was an issue of what could we do in the consultation paper at the point in time, and then bring forward into this bill, and what other issues might be covered in the second stage of this process as regards consideration of this sector. So,
let's ask one more question on that. You said that you will be consulting on the issue that the Netsmen's organisations have raised, regarding their management. When are you likely to be doing that?
I think what I said was that the government are committed to a two-stage process in this sector. So the next stage is to consider what further work needs to be, what further areas need to be looked at in terms of the management of wild fisheries, upon which the netsman within that management regime is an area that I anticipate that ministers will want to look at. But we've not had the discussion with the ministers yet on what the scope of that review should look like. But given that it's a key issue for the netsmen, and it's a key issue which has been raised to this committee through both your visits and through your evidence, I anticipate the ministers will want to look at it. But I obviously can't commit the minister here today, but that would be my anticipation.
When will that happen? When will they look at it?
I would think that the timetable will be that we'll scope out what a review might look like during stage 1 and stage 2 of this bill. Taking account of the views which are expressed there, there'll be a consultation, I suspect, in the latter half of next year, moving with propositions for a bill coming. Well, certainly with the life of the Parliament runs through to 16. So I anticipate that the first part of the process will kick off probably in the lifetime of this bill's passes through Parliament.
Thank you.
Thank you. Alec Ferguson on that point.
If I could go back to the Salmon Fishery Board's issue just for a moment, if I could. There is a school of thought, if I could put it that way, that the way in which further regulation of the Salmon Fishery Boards is looked at in this bill is almost along the lines of, well, we're bringing in further regulation on the aquaculture industry, we better do something about the other sector as well, in order to sort of balance up the regulatory programme, if I can put it that way. I'm not saying it's a widely held school of thought, but it is undoubtedly a school of thought. Can I ask what it is specifically about that sector that makes you believe it needs further regulation? Because there are many people who believe it actually works reasonably well.
The main issue from Minister's perspective is that these are bodies that are established by statute and have powers given to them by that statute. They have, and the question then is, to what extent can ministers, Parliament, general public be assured that those powers are being used appropriately and that boards are undertaking the responsibilities assigned to them through the statutory provisions that they have. One of the reasons for committing to further work in this area is simply the age of much of the legislation involved and the fact that it's been consolidated many, many times, most recently into 2003. And there are questions about, about how fit for purpose the existing legislative regime is for the sector, full stop. But the main drive behind the openness and transparency is simply, in a modern society, is it right that a statutory body does not have a requirement to do the things that are set out in the bill?
I'm grateful for that explanation. I have a number of reservations, but they're probably better addressed at stage 2 and through amendments than just now. But thank you for that explanation. I appreciate that.
Nigel Don, first of all.
Thank you, Convener. If I could just pursue that. I entirely respect the idea that any organisation pardon me, or individual who has statutory power then is responsible for how that is exercised and needs to be accountable for that. But I am conscious that some of the river boards will be really very small, and I think I'm getting the message that if you come up, we come along and say this is the way it's going to be regulated and you need to do X, Y and Z, and if you don't you might finish up in jail, I'm exaggerating slightly, then people are going to say, actually I do this more or less voluntarily, this isn't worth the candle, I'm going away, and you might finish up in a position where the small boards simply cease to exist. Is that understood as a possible consequence of what's being proposed?
I think, as with everything in this bill, ministers want to be proportionate. So ministers are not about imposing disproportionate burdens on small organisations. And I think ministers fully recognise that a lot of these boards are very small and undertaken by people on a voluntary basis who have an interest in trying to improve the fisheries in their area, which is the purpose of the board. So there is no intention of essentially trying to put these smaller boards out of business, but there is an intention of trying to raise the bar in that a lot of what is covered in the bill is carried out there by the better boards. So this is about raising the bar so that everybody undertakes a minimum level in relation to what they do, how they do it, and the transparency of all of that. But I think ministers are very conscious that what we don't want to do is impose a regulatory burden which simply makes it impossible for these guys to improve the fishery, which is their statutory purpose.
Just pursue that to two little technical points which immediately come out of pages 18 and 19 of the bill. We talk about audited accounts. Some organisations can find that incredibly expensive to get audited accounts. It can be a complicated process. Secondly, how is one to send a copy of the notice to salmon anglers and tenant netsmen? Well, probably the tenant netsmen you could find. How on earth is one supposed to send a notice to salmon anglers? You may not have a clue who they are.
I think that's a technical aspect of the bill that we're happy to look at. But one example might be that you simply put a notice up on our website.
Yes, I think that simple solution is one that people would be grateful that was put down and made clear.
Okay.
Thank you.
Can I just ask you a question about what sort of submissions were made on the subject of openness of salmon fishery boards when you were making your mind up about how to proceed with this section?
Yes. You'll be completely unsurprised to hear that there were differing views in this area. Some stakeholders suggested that some boards operated essentially as closed shops and took no account of the local needs, stakeholders and users, and others essentially say that's what we do. So that it's of no issue or consequence to us because we recognise it as good practice. But there are particular sets of stakeholders out there, which has been recognised already, have a degree of friction between their operations and their management. And our ministers are certainly hopeful that having a more transparent regime would facilitate more informed discussions, perhaps, as opposed to less informed fistfights.
Well, I would look forward to discussing that with stakeholders, but thank you for that hint. I think we should move on to part 3 and ask Dick Lyle to ask a question in part 3.
Thank you, Convener. Part 3 deals with sea fisheries, brings Scotland into line with the rest of these islands in terms of marine enforcement powers. This part also makes it possible for sea fishery officers to detain foreign vessels in port in case of alleged offences and allows enforcement officers to inspect and seize objects connected with commercial sea fisheries where an offence is suspected. Few consultees responded to the proposal on sea fisheries. Have there been any further concerns been raised about the provisions in this part of the bill?
We had a meeting with the fishery representatives, Scottish Fishery Federation and FAL, and I apologise, I forget what the acronym stands for, 2 weeks ago with officials, and there are no issues of concern around that part of the bill from the sea fish industry.
Okay, thanks.
Moving on to part 4, this deals with shellfish and amends the Water, Environment, Water Services Scotland Act of 2003. Are any difficulties expected in the transposition of the Shellfish Waters Directive provisions into WEWS Act?
No. This it's a straightforward transposition for reasons that we don't fully understand. The Commission has decided to let a regulation lapse, and whilst it will probably be replaced in time, it leaves a gap in the management of shellfish waters, which is not helpful for our industry or our environment. So ministers are taking the opportunity now simply to transpose what's currently in an EU regulation into domestic law. It should be relatively straightforward. Again, we've had no issues of concern raised in relation to this.
So what effects will the amendments to the shellfish-related order making powers have on wild shellfish harvesting and shellfish farming?
They'll not have the effect of this bit of the bill is to continue the existing protections that are in place, not to bring in any new protections or any new regulation. It's simply to ensure that the existing framework can continue when it drops off the Commission.
Okay, thank you for that. Moving speedily on to part 5 just now, Graham Day wants to ask you a question.
Thank you, Convener. I think we've already covered the generality of my intended question, but can we deal with a specific case? Anglers have expressed concern that rod licensing could be introduced through secondary legislation using the powers contained within Section 50. Now, regardless of whether that's a policy the current government might pursue, would it be possible for such charging to be introduced?
As I understand it, ministers would have to change the whole management regime for angling to enable that to happen. That's essentially what happens through the Environment Agency in England, which is under a completely different management regime. So whether it could happen, I don't know, but I'll ask my lawyers and I'll write to you. Whether it's likely to happen, no.
First aspect, that would be helpful, I think, Convener.
Yeah, I'll do that.
Okay, thank you. Another question on this from Nigel Dawn.
Thank you, Convener. We understand there have been no prosecutions of aquaculture businesses, under the existing rules. Given that, why is it necessary to move to fixed penalty notices, please?
Jeff, do you want to cover fixed penalties?
Yeah, indeed. There are certainly instances of non-compliance at one level or another. It's an additional part of the disposal options for compliance officers that they currently have under their existing functions. And the extension really ensures a consistent approach. It's not suggesting that suddenly there's going to be a raft of fixed penalty notices issued, but it's certainly a natural progression of an existing disposal option that our compliance officers have elsewhere.
I think a key addition to that is this is not an extension of the fixed penalty scheme to aquaculture. It's an extension of a fixed penalty scheme to other marine activities, including aquaculture.
Is it fair to suggest that a fixed penalty notice is one where the person who's not complying has to opt out rather than opt in? But let me explain myself. Maybe it's not so easy to get the evidence you want to bring a criminal prosecution, whereas if you can give somebody a fixed penalty notice, they have to think in default about how they're going to get out of it. Thank you.
One of the concerns that was raised about the original proposal and the leaflet that I explained, which we forwarded to yourselves to have a look at, is very clear about the level of evidence. It's not a dilution of the evidence required. It's certainly an individual's choice to accept or not, and it would follow the due course thereafter about reporting processes up to the fiscal. So it's certainly not a case of a lesser degree of evidence or a confetti approach. You have to take it. It's an option.
I think the key issue here, and I think one that as Jeff says, we've sought to reassure people on, is that individual inspectors would not hand out fixed penalty notices on the spot. Inspectors go in if they uncover an issue of non-compliance that they think warrants a report, then they send a report into a central unit that considers reports from across Marine Scotland activities. And then it's for that unit to identify whether there is sufficient evidence to enable a report to be made to the fiscal. That's the first test. And if there is sufficient evidence, then the question is, do we submit a report to the fiscal or do we offer a fixed penalty? But it's only after the initial test of, is there sufficient evidence to submit a report, do we move on to, and which way should it be dealt with?
Forgive me, it brings me back to the original point that if there have been no prosecutions, why are we expecting there to be circumstances when this might apply in the future?
It's not preempting a raft of fixed penalties, as I said earlier. That's not to say that cases haven't necessarily been reported to the fiscal and they've not chosen to progress that, or indeed fiscals have options to choose a fixed penalty notice themselves or other means of disposal. It's providing a common set of options to our compliance officers across the range of Marine Scotland work. It's an alternative. It's an accepted, almost accepted practice elsewhere in terms of the criminal justice system process. It's a stepping stone to deciding whether the sufficiency of the offence requires to go to the fiscal or otherwise. I mean, I think the key point that I think some forgot is that before the Fish Health Inspectorate became part of Marine Scotland, they were a direct reporting agency to the fiscal, so they still had the ability to go to the fiscal. As part of Marine Scotland and part of the Bill's aspirations, that we're just simply putting in step with how we deal with non-compliance elsewhere, which is that option about a fixed penalty notice being issued by non-compliance by the compliance team after due consideration of the evidence.
Thank you. It's a general policy position being adopted probably for the last couple of decades of moving to non-court disposals wherever feasible in order to free up the justice system from the more minor regulatory aspects of non-compliance.
Well, thank you very much. As the officials in charge of this bill, you've provided us with a lot of bait and lures to play in front of the forthcoming sets of witnesses. It's very useful to know the background technically, and I thank you, gentlemen, for your efforts to enlighten us, and we will follow these up with gusto. Thank you very much. We've now come to the end of the open part of the session. We're glad that lots of members of the public find this an interesting subject and expect to see you all back here as and when we do look at the next set of witnesses. So we will now clear the room of the people who are in the cheap seats. Thank you.